This week's blog post is the fourth in my series on the Clark Art Institute in Massachusetts. For more on the Clark, see the first post in this series. This painting is circa 1800, Sir Thomas Lawrence's The Honourable Caroline Upton. This is very much in the mood of the Gainsborough portrait of Elizabeth and Thomas Linley that we saw in last week's post. A beautiful, charming woman rendered with great finesse. Lawrence, 1769 to 1830, a child prodigy, began his career at age 10 by selling pastel portraits to help support his family. He was knighted in 1815 and named President of the Royal Academy in 1820. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has two of my favorites by Lawrence. One is Elizabeth Farren and the other is the Calmady Children. Last week I mentioned the neoclassical style as the style that pushed out Rococo elegance and Greuze's naturalism. This work is an example of Neoclassicism's influence in subject. The sitter is wearing a white dress in the Greek style, and on her armband is a seated woman playing a lyre. The profile view is also reminiscent of ancient cameos, which were always highly prized. Next up, circa 1815 to 20, is Géricault's Trumpeter of the Hussars. In the mid-1810s, as the Napoleonic Wars were reaching their frenzied climax, Theodore Géricault, 1791 to 1824, painted a series of military figures on horseback. The painting on the right of this slide, mounted trumpeters of Napoleon's Imperial Guard, is typical. It has three cavalrymen in brilliant uniforms shown against a dull background. But the Clark's painting on the left has a different mood. Hussars were notoriously fearless about rushing into battle, and there is indeed a battle raging in the distance, with smoke that looks blood-tinged. But this hussar is a trumpeter, so he can't be in the thick of battle. He has to stay at a distance so he can be heard sounding the advance or the retreat. Short of sending a rider across a battlefield, there was no other way to communicate when over 100,000 men are on the field. Yet the way Géricault shows this soldier makes him look isolated and alone. We can't see his expression, only his profile as he looks intently into the distance. In 1819, probably shortly after he completed this work, Géricault became famous with his enormous canvas, The Raft of the Medusa. After nearly 3 centuries of paintings that glorified France's history and rulers, The Raft of the Medusa starkly illustrated that the French government could be stupid and careless. By 1830, Raft was considered a masterpiece, but by that time Géricault, the rising star among Romantic painters, was dead. He was killed in his early 30s in a riding accident. For more on Géricault, including his thoughts on training of artists and on the role of reason and emotion in art, see my book, there we are, Seismic Shifts in Subject and Style, Chapter 4. Next up, 1816. Romantic painting was on the rise among artists such as Géricault, but it never completely dominated French painting. The Neoclassicists, who morphed into the academics, remained a powerful force. Jacques-Louis David, 1748 to 1825, trained under Fragonard, a leading Rococo artist. There's an example of his work in last week's post. But David switched to Neoclassicism in the 1780s with works such as The Oath of the Horatii on the right. By the 1810s, David was the most famous French neoclassicist. But David was also a fervent supporter of the French Revolution and then of Napoleon. When Napoleon was sent to St. Helena in 1815 and the Bourbons were restored to the throne, David went into self-imposed exile in Brussels. That's why Ingres became the torchbearer for the neoclassicists in France. The subject of this portrait, who is shown in full military uniform, was one of Napoleon's distinguished officers who had also gone into exile in Brussels. For more on David, including his thoughts on the role of reason and emotions in creating art, on style versus subject, and on judging art, see Seismic Shifts, Chapter 3. Moving on to 1821, François-Joseph Navet, 1787 to 1869, a Belgian, studied under David in Paris and then traveled to Rome, where he painted this musical group using Italian models in fancy dress costumes. This painting is very much in the neoclassical style, with crisp, sharp details and a balanced composition. Navez emphasizes the interactions between the figures by their gazes. A man playing a mandolin looks at a woman seated on her mother's lap. The mother looks at a child holding a tambourine, and the child is staring at the mandolin player. On to 1828, and we're back to the Romantics, specifically to Eugène Delacroix, 1798 to 1863, who became the most famous of the Romantics after Géricault's death. For Delacroix and many other Romantics, the purpose of art was to evoke a strong emotion. Sometimes, instead of portraying humans with strong emotions, they showed animals or tempestuous weather. Delacroix uses both in this painting. The halo formed by the pale horse's flying mane suggests that it represents the good, which makes the dark horse, the one who's lunging in to bite the other's neck, represent evil. The violent movement and swift, loose brushstrokes are typical of Delacroix. He also uses them in his most famous painting, Liberty Leading the People, 1830. But there, instead of animals, he uses a combination of realism and allegory to immortalize the July Revolution of 1830. On Delacroix, including his thoughts on the relationship between reason and art, see Seismic Shifts, Chapter 4. And our last painting for this week, circa 1850 to 1870. Paris, I don't actually know how to pronounce that, 1796 to 1875, was the leading figure in the Animalier movement, which was closely linked with Romantics. Animalier artists specialized in realistic portrayals of animals, usually in violent conflict, like the horses we just saw by Delacroix. In the Clerk's painting, the tiger is at rest, but it has a mesmerizing gaze. This artist often visited the Paris Zoo to study the exotic animals for works such as this one. Critic Théophile Gautier called him the Michelangelo of the menagerie. And next week, we will see more from the Clark. DianeDuranteWriter.com has hundreds of posts on sculpture, painting, architecture, and my other obsessions. To join the Sunday Recommendations email list, visit the URL that's on the screen or email me. And you can say, "Well done, Diane," or support my work and receive rewards by means of the tip jar on DianeDuranteWriter.com. As always, thank you for listening.